Welcome everyone to our OpsView webinar titled When Time is Priceless, Is Free Monitoring a Good Deal? Obviously this is about free monitoring, and it's about some of the problems that people have encountered with free monitoring that we've become aware of in the course, in many cases, of solving their problems with free monitoring for them. OpsView is, of course, a manufacturer of monitoring, and we have a long history of working in free monitoring. We were originally a Nagios distribution, a fully Nagios compatible product. We are still a Nagios compatible product at the plugin level. And we love open source for its community, for the agility it permits, and for the way it lets people consume innovation quickly. So do not please get the idea that we don't like open source or that we don't see the benefits of free monitoring. We'll discuss some of those benefits in context in a couple of minutes. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-conspirator, Neil Ferguson. Neil is Director of Customer Success at OpsView, which means he is a frontline responsible in the interface between customers and products and problems, and so is in a unique position to see some of the difficulties that our customers have encountered historically with free monitoring platforms and propose and implement ways that our product can solve their problems, the problems that they encounter with free monitoring, in ways that make good use of existing intellectual property skill sets and procedures, but help them work through some of the limitations and details of the free monitoring platforms and solutions that they have implemented, many of them heavily customized. As I said at the beginning, OpsView has a long history in open source itself, and we are very much aware of the benefits of open source, which of course we use at many levels in our own organization, like most technology organizations. Neil, this is a kind of a summary list of why free monitoring sounds like a great thing in theory. Clearly it's free. Open source is a huge source of innovation. It puts a lot of minds on a problem, working in collaboration without the restrictions of profitability or other commercial concerns in many cases. It lets people focus on the problems that they know best and then collect their solutions in ways that permit sharing with others. It's transparent, it's flexible, things can get fixed fast, presuming that people are actually working on projects and haven't let them lie fallow. Obviously, it's a way of avoiding lock-in to commercial products. It's fun to work alongside smart colleagues to build the next generation of the tools that you use. So in principle, there's absolutely nothing wrong with open source, and we couldn't live without it. But that said, there are some practical problems with free monitoring products, and we've kind of boiled these down into 5 points. This is not a complete list, and in fact we have published recently a series of 10 blogs on free monitoring problems. We have published a large-scale infographic as well on that subject matter. So once you start enumerating problems, of course, you can become very granular. But what we've done here is enumerate 5 sort of basic problem clusters that we see a lot of our customers encountering with free monitoring solutions that they implement. And what we're going to do in this webinar is go through these one by one, talk about what they entail, and show you some examples. The first is difficulty with deployment and management of free monitoring solutions. Neil, why don't you take over here and tell us a little bit about what it's like in your experience to deploy free monitoring products.
Sure, John, thanks. So when I started off at OpsView a long time ago now, it was a sort of very early stage of monitoring, both obviously for us as an organization, but also open source products were relatively immature, and so it was very much the case that any kind of monitoring tool would be difficult to get up and running in the first place. So yes, it was available and free to use and so on, but even finding documentation and so on was a difficult challenge, and it's not necessarily a single product that you're trying to deploy. You're pulling together multiple different things and getting them to work together. So it was really quite an uphill battle. A lot of that has improved in recent years, so things like documentation is a lot easier to find, and generally the communities are much bigger now, so it's not as difficult and challenging as it was, but it's certainly still something that we see as being a challenge to larger organizations in particular, where they don't necessarily have a good understanding of even how to get started with the product, maybe what the best practices are, how to get it deployed and working in a small environment to then scale up further. So it's a difficult challenge to overcome, not even just in monitoring, but open source products in general can be quite varied in their quality, and this is obviously the first thing that you hit when looking at using these tools, the deployment stage and so on, and it can be very time consuming to get this all hooked up together. We see people talking to customers of ours and products they've used in the past or maybe using different parts of their organisation, and they quite often say that whilst they've got there in the end, when they set out to deploy these bits of software, these tools, they had no idea how long it was going to take, and it was quite a voyage of discovery to figure out how things should be done. Maybe it was done one way, then torn down and started again, and use what they'd learned to get started again. And that's fine if you've got the time, but it's difficult for fast-moving organisations who want to keep up with the pace of the industry they're in, to spend all that time learning how to do this and get it to work. And as it says on the slide here, actually, meet your special snowflake. It's one of those creations that you've worked really hard to put together, but in the end you've pulled various different components together and got those particular versions of things working, but you've got something that is then going to be much more difficult to manage in future because you're using very specific versions of things, or perhaps you don't have the information you need to know how to scale with it in the future. So a lot of challenges around the deployment and management side of things, and it's something that comes up constantly with our customers about past experiences and challenges they had to overcome.
It's a not inconsiderable technical challenge, even getting to a proof of concept with a typical free monitoring solution,
yes,
isn't it?
yeah,
As I recall, the last time I tried to deploy a single server Nagios implementation, I had to follow a 35-step recipe before I got the server up with all the libraries in place. And that was less, the additional work of having to integrate the WebUI, CLI, that kind of stuff. Select, source and integrate the user interface components, and then test, which becomes more difficult when you are working with a special snowflake, right? Because that particular path to a solution may or may not be popular, may or may not ever have been implemented at the scale that you plan to implement it. So getting from a working proof of concept to scaled out solution is yet another engineering effort, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's also something that's very, very tempting to put a lot of time into. So I started my career as a Linux admin, effectively, and so spent a lot of my time playing around with open source tools and getting them all set up and so on. And at a personal level, it's really enjoyable, and you commit a bit of time to it, thinking, great, I'll use whatever it is, Nagios or some other tool, and ultimately you normally get it working, and you get it working the way you want, but you commit a bit of time to it, and various bits are working and some bits aren't, and you spend a bit more time on those, and then you get to the point where you've committed so much time to get things working that you don't want to give up and start on something else. So you just add more and more time into that process and end up with a significant amount of work to create that special snowflake in the first place. So it's a time-consuming process, and whilst it's tempting to continue because it's good fun, I think quite often that means you get to the point where you look back and think, okay, if I'd known it was going to take this long when I got started, maybe I would have done something different.
That's the problem, isn't it? I think that the technical name for this sort of situation is sunk cost fallacy, right? Where
exactly.
you continue to chase goals because you've invested so much in reaching them already, and it's something that destroys the fortunes of intemperate gamblers, of all kinds, not just IT people. The problem, of course, in IT is that management, if you were to ask them, want you to develop, on the one hand, the expertise, and they love the idea of a free solution, but on the other, they would prefer you to be doing strategic things that benefit, the company's bottom line and the process and accelerate the business, as opposed to focusing on how to with the monitoring platform. Let's take a look at this example which you proposed as an illustration of deployment problems.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one that's come up fairly recently with us. So it's a particularly large MSP based in the UK, and we started working with them probably a couple of years ago now. One of the things they came to us with was we have a big estate already set up, and we've spent a lot of time on it. It's all Nagios based, and we're having a number of issues with it. They'd already sunk a lot of time and energy into creating custom plugins. Nagios itself didn't come with any kind of discovery tools, so rather than using any available either commercial or open source options out there, they'd written their own. They'd actually ended up writing their own CMDB. So they'd put all this effort into creating a very special snowflake with lots of components distributed across a number of systems. They had teams both in the UK and also out in India all working on the project to set this up in the first place and keep it running. And when they looked at how much time they were spending on that and the fact that nothing was supported and so on, they had a lot of concerns over that platform going forward. And it had also reached a point where they were changing the business and what they wanted to offer to customers, and so they needed to change how they were doing things to meet those business aspirations that they had. So some specific areas that they had concerns over were keeping things up to date. So being a security-focused organisation, they had to make sure that everything was regularly patched and updated and so on, which was becoming a time-consuming process. The risk of things breaking was high. They also needed to automate things to operate at scale because it's a big environment, and having everything held together with scripts is fine when it works, but if something breaks, then the whole part of the process that's affected is down for however long it takes to resolve those problems. Also, the need to have a fully supported platform that they could come and get the help on whenever they needed. One of the additional things that they benefited from in this case was that they could come to us with that legacy of this is what we've done, this is how we've got to where we are now. So we had all their requirements and all the problems with the processes they had been ironed out. It was only the tool set that was then letting them down. So we could come in and replace what they'd built with something, all standard API-based, with updates from the vendor that are, security updates or feature updates and so on, all from one organisation. And they are now in a much better position to take their business forward. So if they looked back all those years ago when they started building this and how much effort they were going to have to go to, I think they probably would have made the decision to go commercial a lot sooner. Not to say that the platform they built didn't give them value. It obviously worked for them for some time, but ultimately that technical debt caught up with them and they needed to move to something more modern. So really interesting use case, that one, and delighted that we've been able to help them out with the problems that they face.
So once you've got your system set up and tested and perhaps scaled out, and you've written the scripts and the automation necessary to run it at enterprise scale and at enterprise speed, you still have an infinity of little problems that you need to resolve. Namely, you need to get all of your diverse stuff, maybe hundreds of individual products and applications and platforms, monitored. And you have to deal with a very limited palette of options in this case. In the case of Nagios, for example, there's a very, very strong set of plugin architectures and a lot of options for how to retrieve and communicate metrics information between monitored objects and masters and vice versa. But beyond that, there's not a lot of hyper-specific plug-and-play tooling available. I think Nagios ships with 50-some-odd model plugins, but beyond that, you're in the world of community-provided add-ons and adaptations, aren't you?
Yeah, it's a bit like the initial case of deployment. The amount you have to get once you finish your deployment, the amount you have there is a relatively basic start to what you need. The next challenge is then filling all the gaps with the technology coverage and the other features that you need from the system. So, okay, I've got however many plugins out of the box, but I have this particular SAN over here, or I have a new operating system that I want to monitor, different versions of an operating system, and getting the coverage for all of those different technologies is a really time-consuming process. You've got to either write things yourself, you've got to source them from somewhere online, and potentially the ones that you source or the ones you create are inevitably not perfect, so you've got to modify those, improve them, make them do what you want, and that's another huge time sink after you've done the initial deployment work. So what's available out the box is often, again, not just with the Nagios example, but any other open source product, often the tool is there, but then the extra modules, features, plugins, whatever it might be, are things that you have to separately deliver yourself. We often have customers come to us with really broad technology landscapes, and they will have some legacy on-premise equipment that is perhaps 10, 15 years old and is running old operating systems that are maybe no longer supported, right through to the very latest where they're spinning up containers, they're running in the cloud, they're using software as a service and want to monitor those services and the service they're receiving and so on. And when you look at that breadth of technologies you have to cover, there is no way that an out-the-box implementation of any free monitoring tool is likely to deliver on that. So it's then that uphill battle of, okay, right, we've got the basics, now we need to do all this work to roll it out even further. And all that time that you're spending doing that is, as you said earlier, John, not time that you're spending moving the business forward. It's not what your managers, your business, and ideally you want to be doing. Do I want to be sitting there finding more plugins to extend something, or do I want to be going and doing new exciting things with different technologies and learning about those? And obviously the innovation side of things suffers because of the day-to-day, the hard work, the legwork of going to find all these various plugins and tools and so on. So just because it's deployed doesn't mean I can then just leave it to run and it will meet all my needs. I've got to keep looking after it on a regular basis, making sure that it's able to keep up with the rest of my business.
It's a matter of maintaining and enlarging constantly a set of hyper-specialized knowledge bases too, isn't it? I mean, I'm just thinking about the example of how do you monitor a MySQL database? There are many ways to monitor a MySQL database, and there are many levels of metrics that you can pull out, but there's also the question of what's the best way to monitor. What are the metrics that you actually need that will actually help in your actual clustered implementation, you to determine what's important in order to ensure availability and performance on a particular implementation of a database. In other words, there's this best practice angle that in a sense, needs to be packaged in the integration between your monitoring and your target for you to really benefit from that, for your database administrators to get from the monitoring dashboard the kind of information that they need in order to determine query links has become a problem or simultaneous queries hitting the database have become a problem. It's very, very difficult to be that expert about all the different platforms that an organization needs to use these days. I mean, databases are a sort of a conspicuous example because everyone acknowledges that database administrators are a thing and that people spend their whole lives becoming experts in different kinds of databases. But what about all that other infrastructure? What about the Apache servers? What about the Nginx servers? What about the Kafka rigs and other things that go into a distributed or containerized infrastructure? That's a lot of knowledge that has to come from somewhere before you can know that you're monitoring things in the best possible way.
Right. It's something that we see a lot, particularly in larger organizations where there are so many different technologies in use. Those sorts of organizations tend to have specialists in different areas, and they can go some way to advising on what things should be monitored, what are the signals that indicate that a failure is imminent and so on. But even so, A, they don't want to be spending their time doing that. They want to be spending time looking after whatever they're responsible for, not helping the monitoring team get the right coverage. But in smaller organizations, those people often just don't exist. So if you take a small growing organization, lots of different technologies, And as you say, a database administrator is an obvious example where there's that specialist knowledge. They may not have a database administrator that's dedicated to MySQL or MS SQL or whatever, and they don't have that depth of knowledge to say, this is how I monitor it. They might know how to do the admin work and they can look after it, but what really are the right things to look for, the right metrics to pull out and compare and alert on and so on in order to make sure that I'm responding to the right problems as quickly as possible. So that best practice advice is really important for both levels of organisation, really, the smaller ones that just don't have the resources, but even the larger ones where those people perhaps exist but don't want to be spending their time helping the monitoring team out and guiding them. They want the monitoring team to be coming to them saying, we understand what your product is, these are the things we think you want to have covered and so on. Are you happy with that? And maybe the relationship there is then to tweak what those requirements are and get it set up. But in each case, you have to go to these people with something to say, this is what we think is the best approach. And that's not what you get often without the plugin coverage and so on. I can go and search for a MySQL plugin to monitor it, but all that tells me is what I can collect. It doesn't tell me how I should set it up and the best way to use it, which things are the key things to alert on. So that's where that best practice comes in, and that's really important in making sure that you can move quickly and get that proper coverage.
As an example of this, you and I talked about this MSP for finance. How were they in a situation where their agility was deflected or slowed by the lack of PACS?
So this was an interesting one because they were moving from an on-premise model into Azure. And it's something that they had limited experience of. It was a new thing to them, and it was going to be a new platform to deliver their service to their customers. So they're doing a lot of learning. They're picking up new skills themselves and the best way to use Azure itself. But by moving to Azure, they're also introducing a whole bunch of different technologies and removing a lot of the on-prem technologies that they had previously. So everything from things like ExpressRoute, hosting databases in Azure, the machines themselves, the networking and so on, all of this was new to them, and therefore monitoring coverage is vitally important because they need to see what's going on in this new environment to make sure that they can keep up with the change and also offer the same level of service to their customers that they were offering before with the environments they're really familiar with. So if they'd been moving into Azure and had to try and pull together different plugins from either open source or building their own or whatever, that would have been a hugely time-consuming project for them on top of the work they were already doing to move their own application. And that's something that just would have slowed them down too much to make it a viable project. So they needed to lean on a vendor or a source of information and help to be able to provide best practice advice and the coverage with plugins and packs to cover all these things, so that they could basically develop a turnkey solution. Here are all my plugins, this is the best way to use them, help you get it set up, and then you're off and running. And this for them is a pilot. Effectively, it's the first time they'll be offering this to one of their customers in Azure, and if this goes well, they'll roll it out to the rest of their customer base. So it's really important to make sure that when they have that first one up and running, it's got full coverage, it's working exactly as it should, and it can be a great example to demonstrate to all their customers that this new platform is going to meet their needs. So without the backing of a good tool set, not just monitoring, but all the other tools that they've had to implement as well, they can't be confident it's going to deliver on their business needs. And when they're making such a bold decision to move everything to a brand new platform, it's really important to them that they don't fail in doing this. And I'm pretty confident if they'd done it with a set of open source tools, pulling it all together with the resources they've got, they would really have struggled to deliver on those requirements.
So the next problem, and it's a problem that a lot of customers of size encounter, is the problem of scale. It seems like there's a problem with a lot of free monitoring solutions that they have something of what you might call a monolithic architecture. That is, you can scale them vertically. You can put them on more and more powerful machines. And in some cases, you can scale them via duplication by creating multiple different systems for the different aggregations of equipment that you need to monitor. But that it becomes difficult after a certain point to grow them bigger, to handle larger numbers of service checks per per unit time, and to get that single pane of glass over your whole estate, that's what you really want for centralized, efficient, and ultimately more and more automated IT operations. Isn't that right, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we increasingly see customers operating at very large scales. In the early days of monitoring that I was talking about earlier, I think a lot of people were used to the single instance of a open source tool, whatever it might have been, whether in Agios or otherwise, and that was sufficient for their needs. And if they wanted to scale further, then okay, you can deploy multiple copies and so on, and that's when you get to the hard to manage again, where you're looking after multiple completely independent systems. And so the need came to combine those systems together or scale a single system further and so on. And that can be achieved in a few ways. There's other open source tools that you can use to link, for example, multiple Nagios instances together. Other tools work in similar ways. And it's possible, but you end up putting a lot of work into this. When you've got customers that are operating at scales of 20,000 hosts, 40,000 hosts, 60,000 hosts, whatever, you're up in some serious numbers where just hacking stuff together with some extra code, basically, to bring multiple disparate systems into a single view, it's just so time-consuming and so prone to problems and errors. It's difficult to upgrade. That scaling process is really painful sometimes, and we often hear from people where this is their main challenge. We hear from them just as they're starting to do that scale up with the tools they've got and are hitting problems quite quickly. So maybe they've got a few instances of a particular tool, and they add another few thousand hosts in, and all of a sudden they realize just how much it's creaky at the seams, and I'm sure it can be made to meet those requirements. There are open source tools that will scale to that level, but making them do it is pretty hard work. And again, you don't necessarily have that support out there because there's no vendor to go to. There might be a community, but there aren't always lots of people in that community that are running systems at that scale, so they haven't hit your problems. You're a pioneer of trying to scale to that level, and it becomes a very painful, time-consuming process. And as it mentions here, there's other issues to consider. What about things like HA, high availability, disaster recovery are all considerations, and those just become additional complexity on top of the scale. So building your system from scratch like that, putting all these components together, is a potentially successful way forward, but a risky and time-consuming one. And I think a lot of people decide that there are better ways to achieve that.
As an example here, we're looking at the case of a major university that has a lot of different campuses. They're dealing with many locations, including a large medical center, as I recall. They have 15,000 or so students. They have a number of technical centers of excellence that they're providing at the very least network and in some cases compute and cloud services for. So they have some very demanding academic users of supercomputing tech and other stuff that they need to provide monitoring for, at least at the level of infrastructure viability. They're moving a lot of their own assets to cloud, and where it sounds like they began to suffer was not just in terms of implementing at scale, but in dealing with the kinds of problems that large scale brings to your door in monitoring, namely the problem of over-alerting. If you're obliged to work with a product that can't, for example, visualize what the availability impact of failure of one node in a resilient cluster is, then you're going to be alerting yourself to death on infrastructure problems, and you're not going to be able to manage that alert stream. You're going to be constantly firefighting as opposed to working in a more sort of asynchronous and proactive way to head off problems and to understand that some problems are simply not critical. Isn't that right, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a much better understanding amongst organizations that you can't just be worried about the detail and only the detail. There needs to be a distinction between monitoring the nuts and bolts of everything, right down at the, what is this CPU doing on this box, right up to the other end where I want to know, is my business service, whatever that might be, whether it's a CRM or a website or some kind of bespoke application, whatever it is that working or not? Is it providing the service that it's supposed to? And there's a lot of layers in between those two extremes where there's resilience built in, there's multiple geographies involved, multiple data centers, maybe it's a mix of on-prem and cloud. So it becomes a really complex environment, and if you don't understand and model what's in that environment, then you end up with, as you say, a great deal of noise, lots of alerts, and you end up firefighting things that maybe don't even need that. So in this particular case, using business service monitoring, we're able to map out those services and say, okay, just because this particular machine has run out of disk space, or this machine has fallen over or dropped off the network or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that this service is impacted at the top level. And when you're providing a view, in this case to students or to end customers or whatever, of the service that you're providing to them, you want to show them what the service is doing. You don't want to show them whether or not there's been some non-service impacting failures. So without that understanding, without a product that can support that sort of functionality, it's very difficult to give that visibility both internally to your organization and to your end customers, whoever that might be. So it's a really difficult challenge to make sure you've modeled everything correctly, and without a tool to support that, it's even potentially not possible. So hopefully this is something that we've been able to help them out on, and they can show their customers what service they're delivering without having to reveal the detail of what's going on behind the scenes.
Jumping onto a new sort of thread for these remaining slides, the outstanding problem of free software is that you don't have a throat to choke. You have to be the expert, which can also mean you end up being the bottleneck when things need to change or get fixed or get improved or get scaled out. And this can be a problem for IT operators. It's a sobering thing to be on Internet Relay Chat at 3 o'clock in the morning asking a user group, outside your time zone for help with a technical problem. And of course, technical experts are not always entirely sympathetic with the problems of enterprises and the problems of people who are themselves perhaps less than expert in the platform and are looking for, who perhaps have complicated problems because of the scale at which they're operating, but not a great deal of knowledge with which to confront those problems. So they can't talk to the community members as peers. That's kind of an uncomfortable situation to be in, isn't it, Neil?
It is, and being completely honest, I've been that guy. I've been the one who's built a system, and I'm the one who knows everything about it. And something goes wrong with it, and everyone just looks at you. It's like, well, you're the only guy that can fix this. And not having anyone to escalate to go to for help, to have to rely on a community who often are extremely helpful, but maybe not when you need them to be, and your urgency is not their urgency. So it's a difficult position to be in. I don't particularly enjoy it when it does happen. It's thankfully been a while now. But I think once you've done that once or twice, you quickly realize the importance of having a throat to choke somewhere, whoever that might be, and something that comes with an SLA and a way to contact them, and also a way to say, look, to me this is urgent, my system's down, I need someone to get on top of this. You just can't do without it if you're trying to run a modern business. And it's amazing that we do still come across people that don't have that level of coverage. I mean, it's possible to solve it with open source by having enough experts on a particular tool, so you do have that knowledge in-house. It can be escalated and so on, but that's an expensive thing to do in terms of resources, and I think people quickly realize that having some kind of commercial vendor at the end of it who can be choked if required is a massive benefit to them.
You make, however, a good point. Is the point here is not always or even often choking throats. The point is finding people who are capable and incentivized to collaborate with you so that you can focus on what's strategic for you, so that you can make demands of the platform in the way that businesses make demands, which is we have a plan, we have to implement it in this quarter, it has to happen in finite time, we don't have 18 months to integrate with ServiceNow or whatever we want to do. How do we do it? And it seems to me where this large global manufacturer example is kind of coming from. We have a team here that has enormous technical expertise. They've designed custom plugins for their free monitoring platform, and they have all sorts of in-house expertise on what they're monitoring, part of which is manufacturing hardware. But they see a need to have a monitoring provider work with them hand in hand to produce the particular integrations and effects that they need to produce to be strategically impactful.
Yeah, so it's an interesting example, this one, because it touches on automation, which is something we haven't looked at so far. It's really a stark contrast to even 5, 6 years ago, how much automation is in place with tools like Ansible, Puppet, Chef, and so on that people are using to automate their environments. It's becoming increasingly important to automate all the tools that work in those environments, and monitoring certainly one of those. And developing your own sort of custom automation is fine to a point, but it can also be another part of the product that sinks huge amounts of your time, and you end up building something that's completely custom to you that other people don't understand. You get somebody in to help you with it, and you have to explain how it all works and fix problems with it and so on, rather than using defined interfaces. So having some automation tools that come with the various products, whatever they might be, and interfaces like REST APIs, SOAP APIs, and so on to communicate between the different systems is a much more efficient way, a much more reliable way of building these systems and moving as fast as the business needs. So when you're doing things like CI/CD, as is mentioned here, automation is the only way to make that happen. And if you're constantly fixing scripts and hacking things together and working around edge cases and so on, rather than using these defined integrations and sort of supporting tools, then you can end up at the wrong moment having to fix some critical problems. So this is another organisation I think that's been able to save a lot of time spent focusing on their monitoring, and now they can use those standard interfaces to drive the tools in their business that allow them to innovate and make forward progress.
Arguably, it's good for IT people to develop expertise, and that is, I think, part of the emotional appeal and intellectual appeal of working with open source, is that because use of these products is so widespread, people want to know about them because it makes them more viable career-wise. But this is also a problem for companies. It can be difficult when key people who are responsible for your monitoring platform choose to leave the company when they have other career opportunities, or they move on, or they retire, replacing that level of expertise, because of course you're talking not only about platform expertise, but expertise in the special Snowflake implementation that is unique to your company and has perhaps evolved over many years. And this can result in companies having to place unrealistic expectations and make unrealistic demands on the labor market.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very tempting thing to do. I've been there myself in the past, building something in a certain way and gathering a lot of knowledge in doing so. But because I'm effectively doing it myself and building it in the best way that I think it can be done, that's not necessarily the case. If I go to another organisation with those stated skills and say, hey, I'm an expert in whatever product this might be, if I haven't had some way to understand whether or not I'm following best practice, whether or not it could be done more efficiently, how it could be done in a different situation to meet the needs of a new business, then those skills that I've said I have aren't necessarily actually useful skills to this new organisation. So you get the two problems where you as an individual think you've built up a lot of experience in something, but actually without a tutor, whether that's documentation, whether it's training, whether it's just seeing how other organisations use something. So you don't have that advantage that you think you do, but then you're also leaving an organisation behind where you've set something up in a certain way and nobody else understands it. So you haven't done yourself any favours really, and you've left behind people where they're going to have to dig out of a hole that you've created. So it is that makes it sound like a very, very dark situation. It's not necessarily always that bad, but it's certainly a risk and something that organisations need to be aware of, where people are developing these skills, but they're very specific to where they're working. And if they leave, then they're going to have to find somebody to replace those, and that may not be easy.
In this example of a major university, this actually happened.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And they're not the only ones that have done that in the past either. They had actually been reasonably successful with the implementation that they had. But as you say, once that knowledge has left and you have to try and replace it, it's not as simple as just going out and looking for an expert in X, because when they arrive and find that it's not been set up the way they would do it and they want to have it redone a different way and using different tools to to integrate it with other systems and bring it all together, it's a huge amount of time to either update or potentially even completely replace what you've got. And so by moving from a bunch of tools pulled together to, again, a single vendor that can provide them with the best practice advice, the help, the training, the APIs that standardize the integrations, and also out-of-the-box integrations with a lot of other major vendors, that meant that it was a really easy solution to configure, deploy, and then rely on. And if the resources that they have now that are working on OpsView Monitor were to leave, then we can absolutely help with that. We already know the system, so we can still provide support on it. But equally, when they're hiring a replacement, it's somebody that either can come with the knowledge already, and it will be knowledge that's immediately applicable to their running system, or if they don't know the system, we can provide them with training, documentation, best practice advice to get things back up and running. So it's still a risk, obviously, that knowledge moves on, and that's just how life is. Unfortunately, people do leave and they go on to different jobs, but it's being able to replace them quickly and efficiently that's really important, and having a product that allows them to do that makes a big difference and stops or removes the risk that suddenly you'll have to halt various projects and so on whilst you pick up the pieces from somebody's departure.
So that, in sum, is some, not all, of the challenges that people we know and have encountered, including some of our customers, have run into with free monitoring solutions. We've been doing some research and writing about this ourselves lately. We've produced an infographic, 10 challenges with free monitoring solutions, and a series of 10 detailed blogs going into not just the issues we've discussed during this webinar, but some more fine-grained issues and drawbacks that people have encountered that have eventually guided them to make choices other than free for their monitoring solution. We hope that you will go to the URL above and consult some of this content. And we hope that if you have any questions for Neil or myself, that you will send them to us by email or other means, and we will make shift to answer them as promptly as we can. Thank you very much.